for the invitation and inspiration to share some of my work here today at the Tropilunch. I'm terribly nervous and also really excited, so that being said, I like to put that out there just off the bat in the beginning. It's been a great series of Tropilunches throughout the semester. I've only made it to a handful, but I have watched a few others online as well. So it's really exciting, the work that people are doing in this program and the people that are coming as well. I'm particularly inspired by the grad students and the work that I've seen discussed over the semester, and I'm excited to be part of this group and to have the opportunity to share some of this work with you today that I'm working on and thinking about. So what are we talking about today is frontiers of environmental justice, human rights, environmental change, and indigenous struggles in South America's Chaco region. And it's going to be slightly different than other presentations I've given, or perhaps other presentations for these Tropilunches this semester, because this isn't one particular paper, this isn't one particular argument that I'm making, but it's actually going to be kind of an introduction, if you will. It's my first semester here as a new faculty member, and I wanted to kind of throw out there a broad array of the work that I've been doing and what's influencing my thinking and where I want to take this research in the future, hopefully bringing along collaborators and grad students as well in this process. So I'm just going to give a broad overview of that. And so that's kind of like this idea of where we're going to go together today. So that you know, I have a PhD in human geography from the University of Colorado Boulder, and a master's in Latin American studies from the University of Arizona. I draw from political ecology, cultural geography, critical development studies in my training, as well as applied anthropology, having worked with the Bureau of Applied Research in Anthropology at the University of Arizona and the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy as well at the University of Arizona. So I'm drawing from a pretty critical framework of critical Marxist, feminist, as well as post-colonial studies in the way that I think about and approach the research that I do, which is largely qualitative and based on grounded ethnographic studies alongside and with community counterparts. And so that's kind of the broad overview of what I do my research on, or at least the methods and theoretical framing of that work. So today I'm going to draw from 3 different publications to kind of tease out some themes of my recent work, so that you can have an understanding of what I've been doing, what I've been thinking about, and where I want to take my future research here at the University of Florida in the Center for Latin American Studies and also Tropical Conservation Development Program. And I should also mention I'm an affiliate faculty member of the Department of Geography in the American, Indian, and Indigenous Studies programs here at the University of Florida as well. So that being said, I'm going to start by talking about a paper called Soy States, which is published in the Journal of, what is it published in? The Journal of Peasant Studies. And this paper, Soy States, Resource Politics, Violent Environments, and Soybean Territorialization in Paraguay, really touches on a number of different themes I'm very much concerned with and think about quite a bit. And that has to do with, one, resource politics, so human-nature relationships, and how people deal with different resource regimes and how those regimes kind of play out in practice. The creation of violent environments, so drawing from Michael Watts and Nancy Peluso's kind of framing of violent environments and that kind of framing of political ecology, and also thinking about territorializations through soybeans specifically in Paraguay, and thinking about the transformations of soy production, what it has done to transform the Paraguayan state, both politically, economically, ecologically, and socially. So these broad ramifications and impacts of soy production in Paraguay, and kind of thinking through those transformations. And what you see here is some of this common kind of soyscape, which many of you know from Brazil and other contexts as well, and those that have also worked in Paraguay are quite familiar with these kinds of landscapes as well. And thinking of this idea of soy states, I'm thinking of not only like the notion of a petro state, so a state that is highly dependent on a particular resource, petroleum, for example, driving that economy, but thinking of soy and its relationship and influence in Paraguay, but also changing states. So thinking about how a condition can change over time and thinking of a state in the usage of that term. And so thinking about how Paraguay has gone from being it's a relatively small country, but it's one of the central actors in the global production and circulation of soybean. It's the 4th largest exporter and 5th largest producer of soy globally today. And so thinking about how those transitions have changed and what impact they've had on not only political economy, but also society within Paraguay. And part of my thinking on this idea of the soy state draws from this, it's a relatively classic example now that's kind of bandied about of this advertisement here, which comes from Syngenta Agro, well, they do genetically modified soy and agrochemicals to support genetically modified soy industry. And they had this ad that came out in the early mid-2000s purporting this notion of this imaginary of the United Republic of Soy. You can't see it so well in this picture here, but this is northern Argentina. All of Paraguay is covered by this imaginary United Republic. It goes into Brazil, Uruguay, and Bolivia. And it's this imaginary of reorganizing territory underneath the banner of the soybean and rethinking really about these social and ecological transformations radically. And I think it's important to think about because within a Paraguayan context, in a relatively short period of time, soybeans have come to dominate the political economy and society and social struggles in lots of parts of Paraguay. You can't go through many parts of the country without hearing much about soy, especially if you're talking with social movements, you're talking with indigenous and campesino peoples about the struggles that drive land inequality and social and economic inequality in Paraguay. So thinking about how that actually kind of took place and happened in Paraguay. And so we see the introduction of soybeans in Paraguay and this kind of territorialization, this material changing of the landscape through the planting of soybeans, starting in the early 1960s with Japanese immigrants as well as Brazilian immigrants starting to come into Paraguay with agrarian reforms. And you start to see this black line here is the area of soybean produced, and then you have the yield below it or above it in some areas. But this kind of slow, gradual increase in the area produced as well as the yield over time from the 60s up until 2001. And then you see this kind of marked line here. What happened in 2001 in Paraguay? What do you think with regard to soybeans? Yeah, Soja Maradona came in. So they call it Soja Maradona because genetically modified soybeans were legally produced in Argentina at the time, and then they were smuggled into Paraguay. So Soja Maradona for the Argentine origin of the soybeans, smuggled into Paraguay and started being produced in Paraguay and started really driving a radical kind of changes in the production methods. So we also see the legalization of one genetically modified crop, Roundup Ready soybeans in Paraguay, and you start to see this radical transformation of the area being produced as well as the total yields are obviously kind of going up with that also from 2001 onward. And so scholars have called this the first wave was pre-GM, and then we have the post wave. And so, yeah.
It's kind of surprising that there's no real change in the yield per hectare along this whole trajectory.
Yeah, you're right. It is kind of surprising. It is, but this is based on the Paraguayan agricultural census data, but it is surprising. You're right. I think that you would see that maybe perhaps some differences in that in the most recent, but there's been some experimentation with getting the technology right and getting it implemented in the state as well during that time. But yeah. So we see these.
It's not just about yielding, right? It's also expensive. You don't have benefits.
Well, that's going to actually plays in very much to what I'm about to get into is this question of overhead and yield, but also thinking about who's involved in this production and how it maps onto social and economic inequality within Paraguay. So thinking about transferring from that kind of positioning there and looking at this map, which is, I'm sorry, it might be kind of tough to see. This is from the Instituto Biotecnológico Agrícola in Paraguay, and this is a yield map for 2017 to 2018, really showing the extent, and so this is southeastern Paraguay. Western part of the country is cut out of this map. What you can see in this yellow or this golden color here is the extent of soybean production in Paraguay in the most recent production season. The blue is rice, and then the red is corn. But really what I'm trying to show and just drawing in this map is showing how the material kind of actual transformation of this landscape to a soybean producing kind of platform in that area. And if we look at actually this other map, which is showing deforestation, this is actually showing carbon stocks, but it is actually a great representation of deforestation in the same area. So this is the extent of the interior Atlantic forest. It's difficult to see. This is an image, a map from the World Wildlife Foundation, but in the 1940s, prior to non-indigenous colonization of this area, this kind of polygon in here, this interior Atlantic forest was about 95% forested with the interior Atlantic forest. Now that's almost inverse, whereas what was once the interior Atlantic forest has been almost 95% deforested. So what you see left are these green areas, right? And it maps on very closely to the expansion of soybean. This initially started not through soybean, the deforestation. It was actually driven by cattle and cotton production, and then slowly transitioned over to soybean production, which is actually, there's an interesting paper by Peter Richards, who will be coming here to give a job talk soon in the Department of Geography that analyzed some of this stuff that he wrote a couple of years ago. It's quite interesting work to look at kind of those transitions. But going back to what Emilio had said, and thinking about reduced costs, we also have very much the concentration of a certain producer group that is being able to produce these genetically modified soybeans. And those are largely large-scale landholders. So we're seeing the distribution, what this graph is showing is distribution of farm sizes. So we have number of hectares of farm size, and then you have the number of farms total, and then the cultivated area and tonnage produced. And you can see a very significant concentration of this production in very large kind of farm size areas, right? So thinking about farms from 500 hectares to 5,000 hectares in size is largely where much of the soy production is taking place, and largely driving a lot. It's upending. What I'm doing in this paper is analyzing how this has largely upended a lot of traditional campesino livelihoods and farming-based livelihoods, driving new forms of land dispossession, but that are also directly impacting indigenous livelihoods and indigenous well-being in this very region, which has led to extreme land inequality, where Paraguay now has, according to the most recent agricultural census, something like 75% of the arable land is under control of 2% of the population. So we have this extreme land inequality and land distribution in Paraguay, which drives a lot of social conflict, environmental conflict, and human rights violations. And this is perhaps most readily shown in the 2012 Masacre de Curuguatu, where 11 campesinos and 6 police officers died through a very violent conflict where you had landless campesinos reoccupying a parcel of land, or occupying a parcel of land, and demanding land rights to that land through agrarian reforms, but coming up against some very powerful political interests that own those lands. And then you have this whole series. It's a very complicated issue of this violent conflict that happens at that time. And it's this very important moment of rupture in Paraguay. It marks social movements, I think, still to this day. It mobilizes social resistance against what is seen as a very classist politics around soybean production and around who controls land and who controls territorial rights in Paraguay and access to political power. And it also mobilizes a lot of resistance. But what's particularly interesting about this moment is that it was also used as a pretext to conduct what many call a parliamentary coup against Fernando Lugo. So Fernando Lugo was a leftist president, came in during the left tide or the pink tide in Latin America, disrupted 54 years of Colorado Party, Conservative Party rule in Paraguay, and he came really to power through the notion of land reform for indigenous and campesino peoples, and also was very ardently against expanding the production of genetically modified crops in Paraguay. Now, it's you can have many debates with different people about the motivations for the Curuguatu massacre and what happened, but there's a very strong correlation. Within 2 weeks, Fernando Lugo is quickly deposed of power, and he was blamed largely for the police force's response and what happened in this event, and it's largely seen as very much has to do with landed elites and interests in Paraguay driving this change, because he was threatening this kind of established socio-spatial order around soybean production and around other sorts of extractive industries that have been happening. And also telling was, within 2 weeks of Lugo's ouster, his vice president ratified and legalized the expansion of, I believe it was 12 different genetically modified crops, many of which were soybean varieties, cotton, and as well as potato varieties. So this is just an interesting set of events. You can look at a number of different scholars that have thought about this and written about this as well. Of course, there's no hard evidence to support that, but it maps onto a number of different political disruptions throughout the region as well at the same time, these soft coups. But in the paper, I'm arguing that we have, with this Curuguatu massacre and the deposition of, or the removal of Lugo from power, a kind of a third wave of soy production in Paraguay, where this rapid expansion now of new genetically modified crops is opening up the potential for new forms of accumulation by dispossession and agrarian expansion in Paraguay through these other genetically modified crops in the region, really. And so we're starting to see this kind of third wave, this continuing trend a bit of the production of soy in Paraguay. And as I mentioned before, this has become very much a motivator for political movements and social movements against the Paraguayan state, demanding human rights to land, demanding rights, campesino rights to agrarian reform, and also indigenous people's rights in Paraguay. It's a very hot button political issue that can't really be ignored if working in Paraguay on these kinds of topics. And this top picture is just some street art that I took a photo of that I think is quite telling and captures much of this kind of political discourse and dynamic, where you have the orange tarp, which is kind of this classic campesino sin tierra tarp, occupying land with the curuguatu and feeding these emergent soy sprouts coming from the ground. You have Horacio Cartes, which is the Colorado Party president that was elected in power following Lugo, serving Paraguay on a plate to U.S. and Brazilian interests that are also in front of the Itaipu Dam. There's a whole lot of imagery going on there, and this whole like faceless mass of patriotic Paraguayans. You can't see it in right here because of this one. It says Tierra, Justicia y Libertad. And I think that, you know, this question of land and justice for me personally is something that I'm very interested in, that kind of weaves through much of my work and thinking through all of these issues. And the research program that I do. In this bottom picture, I think is also quite interesting because I was in Paraguay on the 2nd anniversary of the Curuguatu massacre, and we went to Curuguatu, myself and some colleagues and friends, and we went to Curuguatu to do and participate in a ceremony. And this woman here worked for the State Institute for the Indigenous at that time. She got a phone call about a violent confrontation between a private police force and an indigenous community located relatively close to where we were, and she was requested to go investigate it, and they were my ride, and so I was able to go with them on this trip. And so we drove about 4 hours from where we were, deeper into the Paraguay-Brazil borderland area, pretty close to the Brazilian border. It's very much a frontier area where the rule of formal law is very loose, and other forms of law and authority kind of come into power or come into effect regularly in these spaces. And so what we did is we were rolling through these forests, and there's clearings of soy plantations. There's actually winter wheat at the time, and then forest patches. And then we come to this draw, and we see this massive group of people standing on the other side of the draw in a burnt car in a field. And so then they waved us forward because we found some people from the community on the road as we were driving up. And we documented and took testimony of this community that was defending this small parcel of land that they have been struggling for formal rights from the Paraguayan state. Yet this Laguna, the company Laguna Sociedad Anónima, a U.S.-based soy producing company, is interested in that land, and their private security operation came to violently dispossess the community. So what we have in this case were numerous people shot with rubber bullets, beaten. There are piles of blood in different areas in the spaces that we filmed, took pictures of, took lots of testimony. We were there for a couple hours, and then we ended up loading up a mother and her child and 2 other people and drove them about 9 hours from this space all the way to the capital of Asunción so they could go to the hospital. But this is kind of thinking about these conflicts and thinking about the way that environmental change and resource politics intersect with these violent environments, and how different marginalized groups, particularly campesino and indigenous peoples, navigate and negotiate these environments, and what they can do to either claim land or gain land rights within these kinds of contexts. It's very much a lot of what I've been thinking about for quite some time. And that brings me to another paper that's forthcoming in the Journal of Latin American Geography, and it's called Unsettling Territory, Indigenous Mobilizations, the Territorial Turn, and the Limits of Land Rights in the Paraguay-Brazil Borderland. And so this paper is drawing from the same geographic area. It's actually very close to Curuguatu. It's based on research that I did with the community of Ache indigenous peoples. And I was looking at the fair trade production of yerba mate, and that's why I had originally gone to the communities to work with them on these issues, and thinking about fair trade production of yerba mate and social justice through alternative development mechanisms. But the community was very much embroiled in a long-standing battle for land rights against the Paraguayan state, and it was kind of culminating as I was there. So I kind of got rolled into this as well, and I became very interested in it. And what I see with this Ache community and what's going on is we have something, a broader kind of dynamic across the Americas called the territorial turn. And so geographer Carl Offen in 2003 coined this term, the territorial turn, to talk about the unseeming alignment between neoliberal political and economic institutions like the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund, state governments, and indigenous peoples and Afro-descendant peoples. And there was this kind of alignment in the late 1990s, early 2000s, where all of a sudden the World Bank, which had been kind of positioned in a sense in opposition, at least that was the common discourse of the opposition of indigenous rights or indigenous land rights, and state governments had often seen indigenous rights as kind of outside their purview in some regards. You see this adoption of land titling as a way to facilitate state governance, to facilitate quote-unquote empty spaces, the governance of empty spaces in many areas in Latin America. And you subsequently see between 1995 and 2007 or so, the restitution of about 200 million hectares of land to indigenous and Afro-descendant communities across the Americas. And so this is what often calls the territorial turn. Joe Bryan has also looked at this and thinking about this great emancipatory politics of the territorial turn, opening up the possibility of land rights for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities. And in this paper, I'm thinking a lot about how territory and land rights are very much this political horizon for many social movements, but that political horizon, once is achieved or once arrived at, also opens up a whole new set of politics that come after land restitution and land rights.
Clarification. When you talk about the Afro-descendant communities, you're talking about the Afro-descendant in Paraguay, and are they recognized as such, like a special laws, like in Brazil or not?
So what I'm talking about specifically, thanks for the clarification, Carl often was working more in Colombia, and in the Colombian case in the 70s. Yeah, so thinking about that context in that case, so that's where, when I was mentioning Afro-descendant, that's specifically the kind of context and cases that they were talking about. And so what we have then is an Aceh producer group that produces fair trade shade gun yerba mate for export to the United States. But as I said, when I arrived in the community to research kind of how this production method is working, what's going on, etc., the community, I actually met them in Asuncion for the first time during a protest they had staged. It was a month-long protest bajo carpa in front of the Ministry of Environment, demanding land rights and the formalization and finalization of what had been over a 10-year struggle at that time for land rights from the Paraguayan state. And then, so when I returned a couple months later to do the field research, and so this is Curuguatu, the town that I was talking about, the actual massacre of Curuguatu took place about right here. This is like 30-ish kilometers, maybe, as the crow flies to Cuetewu, which is the Aceh community that I'm now talking about. And Uapo, which was the community I showed a picture of where that violent land conflict had happened, was right here. So this is all in this very kind of close area, but also within the very much the frontier region of the Paraguay-Brazil borderlands. And so that kind of threw me off topic. So what we have then are this long kind of struggle for land rights, this 10-year struggle for land rights within this community, and the state giving Cuetewu the formal rights to reoccupy the land in 2002. So there have been, I should mention that with the Aceh, there have been violent dispossessions basically since the internal colonization of the Paraguay-Brazil borderland in the 1960s, really starting. And then in the 1970s, so grave that, you know, international scholars accused the Paraguayan state of genocide against the Aceh. Those charges were dropped, and because there couldn't be a formal intent shown through in the international court proceedings that took place at the time. But nevertheless, it kind of gives a context of the gravity of the human rights violations that the community has, the broader Aceh community has confronted in their experience with the internal colonization in this region. Tupapau is another Aceh community, a reservation in the area, and there was a conflict over the management of resources, forest resources in the area that caused the Cuetewu community to divide off and seek formal land rights in another space. And so they're seeking land rights at the base of the Reserva Forestal Maracaju. And I had mentioned before that 95 to 97% of the interior Atlantic forest in Paraguay have been deforested. This is a 64,000 hectare acre of forest, one of the last large remaining stands of intact interior Atlantic forest in Paraguay. And this parcel of land known as the Finca 470, just to the south of it, was also one privately held parcel of land that also had intact forest. So Cuetewu goes there, the Cuetewu community establishes their presence on the land and gets formal rights from the state to occupy the land, but then proceeds with a 10-year struggle to gain land rights in the state. Throughout that whole time, they're charged with the responsibility of managing the land sustainably, of deforesting no more than 5% of the land as part of their kind of agreement with the state to go to occupy the land, but yet they're also very much engaged in efforts to defend the land from illegal logging in this area, because the traffic of illegally harvested logs is very common and present just crossing the Paraguay-Brazil border, and then also circulation in Paraguay, but much of it, to my knowledge, goes up into Brazil as well. And so this is just a photo of some of the investigations that we did and looking into the illegal logging of the land in this area. In 2012, the community of Quaketubu wins formal rights in the Paraguayan state land rights community title to this property of land. So what we're looking at here is this polygon is showing Quaketubu, which is the Finca 470 as it's known in the state cadastre. This is the community of Quaketubu over here. And a lot of this illegal logging is taking place on this side, the far end of the community. In 2007, so this is just Google Maps and this is a Bing Maps image. But in 2017, you can see significant deforestation starting to take place in these areas. You see the establishment of small piquetes and roads starting to intrude into the property itself, and then the deforestation of small plots of land all across the eastern portion of the property. This is an agricultural field established by the community itself, and you can see, so they're obviously as well using land in certain ways that are leading to deforestation. But I think that this is a significant kind of impact over here on this end, and really it's shown time and time again through news reporting and contacts that I have with community and have maintained since my initial research, that there's constant incursions of people trying to either campesinos sin tierra, trying to claim the land and establish their own communities there, people trying to legally harvest lumber and export into Brazil, or marijuana producers in the area. And it's left up to the community itself to defend this land versus having the state come in and help them with that. So if we look at another study by the World Wildlife Foundation looking at the Finca 470 and deforestation between 2010 and 2016, you can see that of this 4,000 hectare parcel of land, it's a little bit more than 4,000 hectares, but around 4,000 hectares, since 2010, 1,100 hectares have been deforested as of December 2016. And so I think that this, while on the one hand, the community is again located on this side and they're responsible for a certain amount of deforestation, certainly on this side of the property, much of this deforestation on this side is driven by other groups outside of the community itself, and also other indigenous communities that have started to kind of claim part of the land as well as their ancestral territory. So there's these very intense territorial conflicts and multi-territorialities that are kind of taking place in the folding there that threaten to undermine the territorial rights the community had so long fought for. And it creates kind of these liminal legal situations where you have the community itself being the owners of the land and having the formal land rights, but at the same time having those rights continually denied in practice. And that brings me to a paper that was just published in Geoforum called Indigenous Rights at a Crossroads, where I think about this idea of legal geographies of liminality quite a bit. And this is my more recent research and more recent in-depth study of the implementation politics around the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, moving from the southeastern part of Paraguay to the Paraguayan Chaco. And so I did about 16 months of ethnographic field research among the Sohoya Maxa, Yaque Axa, and Zamocasec communities in the western part of Paraguay, in the Chaco. So this map you're seeing here is just the western half of the country. And I did this research among the Zamocasec, Yaque Axa, and Sohoya Maxa communities to investigate the implementation of 3 landmark Inter-American Court of Human Rights cases on behalf of each community, to see what the implementation politics were actually like in practice, to see what the challenges were of implementing these rulings and how community members navigated between a different sort of political economic challenges driven by cattle ranching, but also a reticent state, nevertheless, to help defend their rights. And looking at those kinds of issues, and in the paper, I examined the case of Yaque Axa explicitly and Sohoya Maxa as well. So Yaque Axa and Sohoya Maxa, both located in a very similar area of the Paraguayan Chaco. They're both the Enchlet Sur indigenous peoples comprise the communities of Sohoya Maxa and Yaque Axa. And what's interesting is that these 2 court cases from the Inter-American Court are extremely important to supporting their territorial rights and to other sorts of rights before the Paraguayan state that kind of give a lot of backing to those rights, and have actually ended up in land restitution to both communities. So what you have here is over 9,000 hectares of land, this blue polygon for Yaque Axa. You have Sohoya Maxa here, 14,404 hectares of land. And you have this condition, though, where both communities are simultaneously the holders of land rights, but constantly denied the access and ability to fully utilize those land rights. And that's this kind of condition of legal liminality, whereas liminal, in its literal definitional term, would be, at transition, being on both sides of a border, never completely in one side nor in the other side. And it's kind of this kind of paradox of being a a rights-bearing citizen that is always subject to the dispossession and denial of those rights regularly. So thinking about how people deal with those issues and how they are manifest not only in discourse, but actually in physical space material geographies that are liminal themselves. We have Jackie Axa here for over 25 years, has been dispossessed to the margin of a highway. And I show this picture and it might be kind of jarring. It's like, why would Jackie Axa be situated here between the highway and a fence, which is literally just on the other side of this house? The house is built up against the fence. It's because even though the Paraguayan state purchased that land in 2012 for the community, which is the property holder for over 9,000 hectares of land, there's no road yet constructed to access the properties. The community living on the side of the road is located somewhere around over here, and it's around 60 kilometers to get from where Jackie Axa is located at the very present moment to their actual property. So they remain dispossessed to the side of the highway, yet have formal land rights and have had those land rights for 6 years now, but the Paraguayan state has yet to build an access road to their property. And so they remain in this kind of liminal legal condition where they're dispossessed, but also possessing land rights at the same time. So Hoyamaxa, similarly, in 2014, won the expropriation of their land from the Paraguayan state. The Paraguayan state made a landmark move. It never expropriated land like this before from a private cattle ranching company to an indigenous group, and actually restituted this land or expropriated this land to the community itself in 2014. However, and so we see this right here. Comunidad de Hoyamaxa, Tierras Recuperadas. It's painted over the former sign that was marking the entrance to the cattle ranch, and it's a phenomenal victory. However, and it's a big however, the cattle ranching company will not cede the title to the land. And so on the one hand, within Paraguayan law, the cattle ranching company is still the legal owner of the land, yet the community is also the legal owner of the land because they have this law of expropriation. And so how are these kinds of tense situations negotiated and navigated? This house here of the administrator of the ranch is still occupied by cattle ranching staff, which has created numerous kind of violent confrontations between the community and the administrators themselves, one of which was caught on film by a friend of mine, Olga Kristaleva, and where a police officer is holding back a member of the community when the administrator of the ranch is drawing his gun to point at one of the community members as well. And this was a very peaceful kind of interaction where community members went with police to ask and request the vacation of this house in accordance with the law of expropriation and law in general. And so you have this production of these new liminal and new legal geographies that are quite problematic, quite vexing, and kind of undermine rights in practice. And so I'm thinking about all of these issues throughout my studies and the work that I've been doing, and thinking about the fact that securing territorial rights is a fundamental first step toward indigenous struggles for self-determination. There's no doubt about that, no question. Yeah.
So in this way, access, if these people who have the legal rights, like have these rights, what is the motivation for the cattle ranchers to say that they're not ranching the cattle or money?
That's a great question. The motivation is they do not want to cede control of the land whatsoever, and they don't want to. I think that they see it as a fundamental erosion. Well, I know I've done interviews with members of the company themselves. They see it as a violation of their constitutional rights to private property, and that the expropriation is totally illegal. And so that's their argument. They challenged it twice at the Supreme Court level and lost 2 times, but yet still will refuse to cede the land. And now they're just holding out for more money, essentially, to be paid for through the expropriation. But yeah, it's a really good question. So yeah, securing territorial rights is a fundamental first step to support indigenous struggles for self-determination, but land rights alone do little to change broader colonial power relations that reproduce indigenous dispossession and environmental injustice. So going back to that idea of the horizon, the political horizon, and this goal of being land rights, it's critically important. I'm not arguing against that by any means whatsoever, so please don't be confused, but I'm thinking along the lines of a number of other critical human geographers like Joel Wainwright, Joe Bryan, Penelope Anthias, even Charles Hale, anthropologist as well, and numerous others that are looking at now how indigenous political struggles have been oriented toward gaining land rights for quite a long time, but then once achieving land rights, what comes next? What is the after effect of land rights also? And so thinking about how do we, I think the real challenge is thinking about how to support indigenous environmental justice on the face of frontier deforestation and extractive industries that drive radical environmental change. So you have the de jure or in law support of indigenous rights, which is fundamentally important, but the practice of those rights is also constantly undermined by extractive industries. And of course, this isn't necessarily something new. It happens all the time, but I think we have to think about new political strategies to address those challenges. And so that's one of the main kind of issues that I've been thinking about quite a bit, and that I'm turning to in this next project, which is called Frontiers of Environmental Justice, Human Rights, Environmental Change, and Indigenous Struggles in the South America's Grand Chaco. And I just received a small seed grant from the University of Florida International Center through their Global Fellows Program to support this work, and Bob Walker is the faculty mentor on the project. And so the idea is, this is very conceptual at this point, but the idea is to begin building a collaborative network to really think about investigating these issues beyond, within Paraguay still, but also beyond Paraguay, in Bolivia and Argentina, and to build not only a network of scholars that are looking at these issues specifically with regard to indigenous peoples and indigenous territories, but also thinking about and rethinking environmental justice as well, and those kinds of frontiers also. So in the last couple minutes of the presentation, I'm just going to point to the directions that this project is kind of taking at the moment. So what we have here in this small map, this inset map, is image, if you can see from where you're sitting, is the Grand Chaco. So it's over 1 million square kilometers, much of which is in, I think nearly 60% of that is in northern Argentina, nearly 30% is in Paraguay, and the remainder is in Bolivia, and just a little finger goes into Brazil. And the Grand Chaco in this image is comprised of both the humid and the dry Chaco. And so if we look here, this is from the Global Forest Watch. This is total deforestation from the year 2001 to 2016, and looking at this broad swath of South America. And more or less, the Grand Chaco would fit, that convoluted polygon would fit in this area here within that green box, just kind of drawing your attention into these areas of deforestation. The Paraguayan Chaco is extremely threatened with regard to deforestation. Deforestation, the frontiers of deforestation in the Paraguayan Chaco are rapidly advancing. It's, for the last decade, has been considered one of the top 10 areas, hotspots for deforestation globally. I think there's very little attention actually on what's happening in the Paraguayan Chaco, and really mobilization around trying to address those issues. A lot of that deforestation is being driven by a law of zero deforestation, which was passed in 2004 in southeastern Paraguay, which inadvertently created leakage into the Paraguayan Chaco, but also alongside that production of GM soy, dispossessed actually the cattle ranchers to some degree. And so you have cattle ranchers moving from southeastern Paraguay into what was once a very, very cheap, I mean, in the early and mid 2000s, the Paraguayan Chaco was dirt cheap. Now it's very expensive. Land prices have increased in different areas from 300 to 500%. But you have the establishment of cattle ranches in that area that go from 100,000 to 600,000 hectares in size. They're enormous. And then you also have a strong frontier of deforestation in northern Argentina, in the Argentine Chaco, and then around the Santa Cruz department. So this is from Guira, Paraguay, environmental NGO there, does great work on monitoring deforestation at a regional scale. And this is for the year of 2015, but the trends are largely the same right now. But you can see Boquerón department of the Paraguayan Chaco is kind of like this real hotspot of deforestation, followed closely by Alto Paraguay, Santa Cruz, and then Santiago del Estero and Salta. Those different departments in Bolivia as well as in Argentina. So what does the deforestation look like? It looks different than in southeastern Paraguay. This is the Paraguayan Chaco here, this is the Rio Pilcomayo, and this is northern Argentina here, so that's the border between the two countries. And this is a legal deforestation within the Paraguayan Forestry Code, where I believe it's 20% that ranchers or anyone has to leave on their property. So using a very easy GIS analysis, one can determine exactly how much hedgerow to leave and or small islands to leave in this kind of forest landscape to create the maximum pasture lands for cattle ranching, but also leave within the letter of the law forest. And so this is a landscape that is actually, you see it across the Paraguayan Chaco through remote sensing analyses, and it's fantastic, frankly. And I'm very curious to see what it looks like in 30 years, because these hedgerows will certainly degrade, at least that's my suspicion, and all these small islands will certainly kind of degrade over time, which I don't think is too far in the stretch of the imagination. And many studies are actually arguing that if the current rate of deforestation continues in the Paraguayan Chaco at its current rate, that by the year 2030, the Paraguayan Chaco will be basically the same as the interior Atlantic forest on the other side of the country. In other words, like gone. And so what are the ramifications of these environmental changes on indigenous peoples and indigenous rights? Numerous studies evaluate the drivers of frontier deforestation on the macro scale, looking at landscape or regional scale changes across the Grand Chaco. And these have been fantastic studies that have done a lot to think about the drivers of the change, the effects of those change, and what has happened over time. And they've identified really the primary drivers, which probably aren't surprising. It's largely cattle production, principally in Paraguay, it's for cattle production. But you also have that to a degree in Argentina, but mostly in Argentina we see GM soy production is largely produced in that area, and then you also see that in the Santa Cruz department in Bolivia as well. In Bolivia you also see some amount of hydrocarbon exploitation, but I think that it's relatively marginal as far as deforestation driver, but yet the infrastructure for that does open up, as we've seen in other forested regions. Once you start cutting roads into different areas and putting in pipelines and that sort of thing, it opens up the potential for new kinds of exploitation and deforestation in these areas. In the other studies, so we have these grand macro scale studies that look regionally at kind of what's been happening. We have other studies that look at very kind of point-specific indigenous struggles through grounded case studies, numerous anthropologists and some geographers as well, but listed there along with many others. But there's to date really no studies that I have identified that look at and take a multi-scalar analysis with a critical participatory approach across different sites in these countries to broadly understand the lived effects of these environmental changes and how organized resistance to these changes can create, you know, some sort of environmental justice for different communities there. How much time do I have? 15? Okay, cool, thank you. So I'm drawing in the study from the notion of frontier, and I'm very close to the end. I'm drawing in the study from this notion of frontier from critical human geographers, Teo Balve. He is at Colgate University, does really interesting work on political economy and political ecology. And he's arguing in his recent paper in the Journal of Agrarian Change that thinking of the frontier, and if we think about the narrative that we find, at least in the Paraguayan case, and I think in Argentina as well, that these forms of political economy are the drivers of development, and they're the drivers of kind of a transition to modernity for the state. Paraguay has become, has experienced rapid economic growth, largely through soy production, and the windfall of money that has come through soy production in the Paraguayan state. So it's seeing it as kind of this driver of change. And Balve is talking about these drivers of change. He calls them, quote, "Nowhere are these storms of progress, the gale force winds of capitalist modernity, as destructive as in those spaces we call frontiers. And yet frontiers are, by definition, where these forces have supposedly not run their course yet. Frontiers, then, are spaces reproduced by both the power and the limits of reigning regimes of accumulation and rule." And thinking about how that comes together, he continues to say that frontiers are these spaces in which the rule of law is contested, political authority is explicitly in question, and economic relations are already wrought by violence. And I think that for me, that's a helpful way of thinking about the frontier, because if I think back to the Quaketuwu case, or I think back to Curaguatu in the Paraguay-Brazil borderlands area, where you have this constant kind of struggles over political authority based on the control and struggles over natural resource access, you have these different forms of violence that are exacted on the bodies of laborers working on these ranches or dispossessed from these ranches, of indigenous people that are struggling to defend their territories in the face of these frontier expansion areas, but also thinking about the ecological violence that is exacted when we change landscapes fundamentally and permanently through these large-scale and rapid forms of deforestation that are happening. So I think that thinking about that notion of a frontier and how it applies to the Gran Chaco is quite significant and I think useful. And I also want to do in the study is to take this frontier of environmental justice studies work further. So environmental justice has long looked at the unequal distribution of environmental hazards on largely by racial and class lines, and thinking a lot about pollution and those types of issues. It's obviously much more deep and extensive than that, but I'm drawing from work by David Pello and thinking about critical environmental justice, where he's drawing and trying to push out the boundaries of environmental justice studies beyond what has largely been an urban focus, beyond what has largely been a class, race, and gender focus. And he's arguing for 4 different kind of pillars of this critical environmental justice studies. He's arguing that first we need to move beyond race and class to focus on multiple forms of inequality and intersectional oppression, but also thinking about within that, particularly the experience of indigenous peoples and that are not necessarily living in urban spaces and how they're involved in these issues. to shift to multi-scalar analyses of environmental injustice and possible resolutions to such injustices. Whereas environmental justice scholarship to date is largely focused on more or less one scale, maybe the scale of the city or the scale of the region. They're calling for multi-scalar analysis. As a geographer, we think across scales regularly, and so this isn't necessarily outside of my realm of thinking. But I do think that there's a lot of room within studies of these frontier deforestations in the Gran Chaco to contribute to this scholarship. And also thinking about focusing on the various forms of power, including state power and its limits. So as I've been talking about, thinking about the limits of state power insofar as property rights and territorial restitution has specific limits. It's an important goal, but it also has limits. And so how do communities work around those limits to create new forms of self-determination and political autonomy? And then lastly, he's arguing for a focus on the indispensability of marginalized human and non-human populations facing socio-ecological threats. So really looking at not only how humans are impacted within environmental change, but also non-humans and the relationships between humans and non-humans, so the biophysical environment and people, and arguing that all populations are indispensable and that we cannot achieve any sort of environmental justice unless we are supporting the rights of all, essentially. So a much more kind of holistic approach. And within that framework, I want to contribute as well to burgeoning scholarship and arguments about land rights as human rights. So how do we take land rights and codify them as a human right? So Jeremy Gilbert and other legal scholars are thinking very much about this. You can see some kind of frameworks for that with the International Labor Organization Convention 169 on the rights of tribal and indigenous peoples, and some of the other indigenous rights jurisprudence out there arguing for land rights as human rights, but yet it's not codified in law or legal frameworks yet. So trying to use this as a way to get there. So in conclusion, really, in 2018, in the summer, I'm going to travel down and start building out the network by visiting some colleagues in Buenos Aires and Salta, meeting some new colleagues in Tarija and Santa Cruz, Bolivia, and then going to Philadelphia and joining with some old friends there and driving around the Paraguayan Chaco. Throughout these, I'm going to scope some potential field research sites, define questions for the full study in conversation with people, my colleagues and indigenous peoples in different communities, particularly in Paraguay to begin with, and to begin developing a grounded methodology. And all this is aiming toward a proposal submission in 2019 or 2020. And I'm really interested in working with students that are interested in these kinds of topics. I'm really interested in collaborating with faculty that are also interested in these kinds of topics and issues, and think that there's a lot of interesting potential for collaboration across this study, right? And so other specific ways to get involved, this is more geared, I think, toward students, but I'm going to teach a class in the spring on indigenous rights, environmental justice, and development. A part of my coming here, I came from the University of Arizona, and so the University of Arizona Center for Latin American Studies and the University of Florida Center for Latin American Studies put in their Title VI proposals funding for a series of workshops, and so both centers received the Title VI, and so we're going to do a series of indigenous rights and environmental justice workshops starting in the spring here, and then it'll go to University of Arizona the next year, and we'll basically go back and forth over the next 4 years, really thinking around these issues of environmental justice, indigenous rights, and human rights. And then we have the 2020 Being on Earth conference. Simone can answer questions about that. I can answer some as well. We're working on thinking through that and organizing that, so it should be really interesting and a great way to dig in deeper. And then there's the Indigenous Studies specialization that I became the coordinator of recently. So if you have questions about that, want to get affiliated with it, please do. We have one student. It'd be great to have more than one. So that being said, thank you very much. I think I went way over my time, but if you have any questions.